A quiet shift began in Africa in the late 1990s. Most people outside the continent barely noticed it. Reports from the time showed Chinese engineers arriving in small groups. They stepped off planes in Nairobi and Luanda carrying simple canvas bags and heavy surveying tools. There were no speeches, no announcements. Just a steady flow of people who started asking local officials about roads, ports, copper fields, and power lines. At the same moment, Western lenders were still focused on structural reforms. Meetings in Washington and Brussels were centered on budgets and repayment schedules. Africa was seen through spreadsheets. China approached it through construction sites. That difference set the tone for everything that followed. One early example came from Zambia in 2000. According to archived reports, the old Chambishi copper mine had been losing money for years. Several Western operators had passed on it. A Chinese state firm stepped in quietly. They paid a modest price. They reopened the tunnels. Local residents said the most noticeable sign of change was the sound of trucks moving again through the night. It was small but symbolic. This topic matters because those early steps turned into one of the largest resource and infrastructure races of the 21st century. It shaped supply chains for cobalt, copper, oil, bauxite, and rare earth minerals. It influenced roads, debt agreements, and even voting patterns at the United Nations. Yet the story rarely appears in simple form. It is usually buried under technical language and political noise. For many viewers, the real question is simple. How did a quiet set of deals from the late 90s grow into a strategic contest involving the world's biggest powers? Have you ever wondered why so many major companies and governments now describe Africa as the key to the next 50 years? We will follow that thread one step at a time. The real beginning sits earlier than most people expect. It traces back to the early 1970s when several African countries gained control over their natural resources for the first time. New governments in Angola, Mozambique, and Nigeria tried to shape their own economic paths. According to archived records, many of them struggled with limited capital, weak infrastructure, and shifting commodity prices. Western lenders offered loans with long conditions attached. The deals focused on reforms rather than construction. By the late 1980s, a quiet fatigue had settled across many capitals. Ministers in Lusaka and Dar es Salaam reportedly described a cycle of negotiations that produced little more than paperwork. Roads stayed unpaved. Power grids remained fragile. Mines sat idle because equipment dated back to the colonial era. This atmosphere created an opening that few recognized at the time. China began sending small economic teams to study local needs. One early delegation visited Ethiopia in 1995. A former official recalled how they spent days walking industrial zones rather than sitting in hotel conference rooms. They asked simple questions about cement plants and rail lines. It felt different from the usual visits. A small anecdote from Ghana shows how overlooked this early phase was. A retired port worker said that in 1997 a group of Chinese technicians spent hours at the Tema port measuring the depth of older berths. Local workers assumed they were researchers. They had no idea these measurements would later feed into a major expansion project. When you think about the global map today, do you remember any moment when you first heard that China was investing heavily in Africa? These early steps set the stage for a shift that would soon become visible. The first clear shift in power appeared in the early 2000s. Commodity prices began rising after years of stagnation. Copper, cobalt, and iron ore all climbed as global manufacturing expanded. Africa held large reserves of these materials. China recognized this early and moved quickly. In 2003, Beijing announced a new foreign policy principle called the Going Out strategy. It encouraged state firms to secure long-term access to resources overseas. Western governments were focused on the Middle East at the time. Africa received less attention in public discussions. That gap turned into an advantage for China. According to trade data from the period, Chinese investment in Africa rose from under $1 billion in 2000 to more than $9 billion by 2009. Insiders in several African ministries reportedly noticed that Chinese delegations arrived with two things. Western teams rarely brought together. They offered financing and construction capacity in the same package. A loan would come with engineers. A port proposal would come with cranes. The model felt efficient to local leaders. One illustrative example came from Sudan in 2005. Chinese firms helped expand the Maro Dam. Local workers said they saw new equipment arriving every week. It showed how fast the shift was happening. As these projects multiplied, ordinary traders in cities like Nairobi and Dakar noticed small but telling changes. Shops began selling inexpensive Chinese tools and generators. It signaled a new economic presence that reached everyday life. Do you remember the first time you noticed more goods or investments from China appearing in the news or in markets around you? This shift in confidence and speed created the conditions for a deeper mechanism that soon became visible. The first clear shift in power appeared in the early 2000s. Commodity prices began rising after years of stagnation. Copper, cobalt, and iron ore all climbed as global manufacturing expanded. Africa held large reserves of these materials. China recognized this early and moved quickly. In 2003, Beijing announced a new foreign policy principle called the Going Out strategy. It encouraged state firms to secure long-term access to resources overseas. Western governments were focused on the Middle East at the time. Africa received less attention in public discussions. That gap turned into an advantage for China. According to trade data from the period, Chinese investment in Africa rose from under $1 billion in 2000 to more than $9 billion by 2009. Insiders in several African ministries reportedly noticed that Chinese delegations arrived with two things. Western teams rarely brought together. They offered financing and construction capacity in the same package. A loan would come with engineers. A port proposal would come with cranes. The model felt efficient to local leaders. One illustrative example came from Sudan in 2005. Chinese firms helped expand the Maro Dam. Local workers said they saw new equipment arriving every week. It showed how fast the shift was happening. As these projects multiplied, ordinary traders in cities like Nairobi and Dakar noticed small but telling changes. Shops began selling inexpensive Chinese tools and generators. It signaled a new economic presence that reached everyday life. Do you remember the first time you noticed more goods or investments from China appearing in the news or in markets around you? This shift in confidence and speed created the conditions for a deeper mechanism that soon became visible. The first unexpected consequence appeared slowly. As more projects were completed, African governments gained visible new infrastructure but also carried rising debt linked to long-term agreements. Reports from 2015 showed that several countries had borrowed heavily for rail lines, highways, and energy grids. Angola alone had accumulated more than $20 billion in credit connected to oil-backed loans. The numbers were large enough to reshape national budgets. Western analysts reportedly reacted with concern. They questioned whether these loans created dependence. Chinese officials argued that the projects generated growth. Local leaders often said the same. They pointed to new bridges, expanded ports, and fewer power cuts. The debate rarely had a simple answer because each deal worked differently. One statistic from the African Union showed the scale of the shift. By 2017, China had built or funded more than 6,000 kilometers of African railways. No outside power had matched that level of activity in decades. That achievement carried weight, but it also meant that maintenance, repayments, and long-term management became new challenges for many governments. A relatable story came from a shop owner in Addis Ababa. He said the new light rail made it easier for customers to reach his store. But he also wondered whether the city could afford to keep the system running if revenue fell. His question reflected a wider uncertainty felt across several countries. Have you ever seen a project in your own community that brought benefits, but also created questions about how it would be supported over time? These mixed outcomes set the stage for a steady escalation that followed in the years ahead. The escalation began when global demand for critical minerals surged. Electric vehicles, battery storage systems, and advanced electronics required cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements. Africa held many of these resources. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo produced more than half of the world's cobalt by the late 2010s. This concentration shifted attention sharply. China had already positioned itself through long-term contracts and mining partnerships. Western governments grew concerned that supply chains were becoming too dependent on a single player. In 2019, several policy papers in Washington and Brussels urged diversification. Japan and South Korea issued similar assessments. The competition moved from individual projects to strategic control. Numbers from trade databases showed the scale of the change. Between 2010 and 2020, China reportedly invested more than $40 billion across African energy and mining sectors. Western firms increased activity as well, but often faced higher bidding costs and slower regulatory approvals. This gap widened cooperation between Chinese companies and local ministries. One small anecdote from Namibia illustrates the shift. A local journalist recalled how a Chinese exploration team arrived in a remote town with satellite maps and drilling equipment. They set up operations within days. Western firms had been studying the area for years but had not moved beyond proposals. Residents said the contrast was striking. Do you remember a moment when you realized how central minerals had become to global politics and technology? This rising demand and accelerating investment brought the contest to a new pressure point. The breaking point arrived when several African governments began reassessing the long-term costs of earlier agreements. By the early 2020s, repayment schedules tightened as commodity prices fluctuated. According to finance ministry filings in Kenya, Zambia, and Ethiopia, loan servicing consumed a growing share of national budgets. This created tension that had been building quietly for years. International institutions stepped in with new scrutiny. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank asked for greater transparency around loan terms. Several governments were asked to disclose project contracts that had previously been kept confidential. This pressure revealed clauses that some officials said they had not fully understood at the time of signing. It became clear that infrastructure had been delivered quickly, but financial obligations were heavier than expected. Western governments saw an opening. They promoted alternative financing models and called for what they described as sustainable partnerships. China defended its approach and emphasized that most projects were performing as planned. The debate grew sharper in public statements yet remained measured behind closed doors. One eyewitness-style anecdote came from a Zambian official who attended a tense review meeting in 2021. He said the room felt unusually quiet as analysts presented numbers showing how debt linked to earlier mining agreements had exceeded projections by several $100 million. He remembered that no one raised their voice. Everyone simply listened. It marked a turning point in how the deals were perceived. Have you ever experienced a moment when a decision made years earlier suddenly felt heavier than you expected? This quiet pressure pushed the world toward recognizing a deeper pattern connecting all these events. A clear pattern emerged when the pieces were placed side by side. China offered speed, scale, and long-term planning. The West offered oversight, conditions, and gradual development. Africa became the place where these two approaches met. The contest was not loud. It unfolded through contracts, construction sites, and supply chains. Historical parallels help make sense of it. In the 19th century, European powers built railways in India, Egypt, and parts of West Africa to secure trade routes. In the 1950s, the United States financed massive infrastructure across Japan and South Korea to shape post-war alliances. In each case, major powers invested abroad not only for economic gain, but to influence the future. The pattern repeated in Africa with new actors and new tools. The underlying mechanism was simple. Whoever builds the roads, ports, power grids, and railways shapes the flow of resources and political relationships for decades. According to older trade records, this has been true from the Suez Canal in 1869 to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 1977. Infrastructure creates long memories. One thoughtful question sits at the center of the pattern. What happens when a continent rich in minerals and potential becomes the focus of two global strategies that rarely move at the same pace? This pattern explains why the choices made 20 years ago now carry so much weight. It also points toward consequences that extend far beyond Africa's borders. The next step is to see how those consequences shape the world we live in now. The long-term consequences began appearing in the mid-2020s. Global supply chains shifted toward regions with stable access to critical minerals. Cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, bauxite from Guinea, and lithium from Zimbabwe became central to manufacturing plans in Asia, Europe, and North America. Decisions made in earlier contracts shaped who controlled processing plants, export routes, and pricing power. Trade data showed that China refined most of the world's cobalt by 2024. This gave it influence over battery materials used in electric vehicles and grid storage systems. Western governments responded by launching new mineral partnerships with Africa. The United States announced agreements under the Minerals Security Partnership. The European Union pursued similar arrangements aimed at diversifying supply lines. These efforts acknowledged that earlier hesitation had created vulnerabilities. African governments gained leverage as well. Countries like Namibia and Ghana insisted on local processing, rather than exporting raw ore. They argued that value should remain within the continent. Some projects shifted to reflect this demand. According to industry reports, local refining capacities slowly increased in several regions. The balance of power became more complex than before. One relatable example came from a teacher in Kigali who said the new industrial park outside the city changed how students thought about their future. They talked about engineering and mineral sciences rather than leaving the country for work. It showed how large geopolitical decisions filtered into everyday life. When you look at the devices you use each day, do you ever think about where the materials inside them were mined and processed? These long-term consequences set the stage for the final reflection on what this quiet contest truly means. The deeper meaning of this story rests in how quietly global influence can shift. Africa's roads, rail lines, and mineral contracts did not dominate headlines each day. But they shaped the direction of industries, alliances, and budgets across the world. China advanced through steady construction and long-term planning. The West relied on oversight, partnerships, and gradual reforms. Both approaches left marks that will last for generations. One historical echo helps frame the moment. In the early 20th century, British control of Persian oil shaped global politics for decades. Few people at the time understood how one set of agreements would influence energy markets and foreign policy. A similar dynamic now unfolds around cobalt, copper, and lithium. Whoever helps build the systems that move these resources often gains influence far beyond the mines themselves. The takeaway is simple. Infrastructure and long-term contracts are not just physical assets. They are quiet commitments that tie countries together. They guide trade patterns, investment flows, and political choices. They shape the world in ways that many people only notice years later. What does it mean for the next generation when two major powers invest in the same region with different goals and different timelines? This moment invites a calm reflection on how global power is built not only through speeches or military strength, but through the roads and agreements that define everyday life. Every story about global power eventually comes back to people living their daily lives. The roads that shorten commutes, the ports that bring food and medicine, the mineral projects that shape jobs and education. All of these pieces remind us that large geopolitical shifts are felt in small, personal ways. Africa's quiet contest between China and the West is still unfolding. Its full meaning will become clearer with time. But understanding the pattern helps us see why today's headlines often trace back to decisions made decades earlier. What part of this story stood out to you the most? If you enjoy stories like this and want to explore more gentle deep dives into history, economics, and long-term patterns, feel free to subscribe. Thank you for spending this time with me. Let's continue learning together.